In the quaint, secluded village of Inverness, Scotland, where the wind carries tales of ancient folklore and mysteries, lived Duncan, a grizzled old fisherman with a heart as deep as the loch he adored. He was a simple man, an individual content with his world that consisted of three integral parts: his worn-out home by the loch, his weary but sturdy wooden boat, and the vast enigmatic Loch Ness. His life, for as long as he could remember, had followed the same rhythm, the ebb and flow of the loch seemingly synced with his own heartbeat. On this particular day, just like any other at the dying embers of twilight, Duncan prepared his boat for another pursuit into the eerie embrace of Loch Ness. As he pulled on his threadbare woolen jacket, he heard the loch's whispers, a soft humming that, he believed, told tales of forgotten yore. Only to him, though, it seemed less a lullaby and more a cryptic forewarning. Nonetheless, with an easy single-minded determination that came from decades of routine, he dismissed it as just another night on the vast open waters. The air was heavy with the faint aroma of peat, whispering of storms to be and spirits past. His heart felt the weight of unusual tranquility as he pushed his boat off the shore. The loch's surface was a mirror under the ethereal moonlight, the peace only interrupted by his boat's gentle skittering across the water. Duncan settled into his seat, his well-worn hands automatically performing the checks and preparations for his lonely vigil. As his tiny craft touched upon the heart of the loch, moonlight glistening off its blackened surface, a lingering chill crawled up his spine. The familiar silence felt different tonight, more poignant, more profound. It was as if the world held its breath, waiting for an act in a grand performance yet to unfold. The usual owl's hoot was missing, the rustling leaves uncharacteristically muted, and the water was too still, too silent. Duncan's life was a testament to his bond with the water, forever living on the edge of myth and reality. Tonight, this bond was to be tested, as his senses tingled with the undeniable truth that the surface tranquility hid a stirring restlessness beneath. As he cast his line into the seemingly peaceful waters, intuition whispered in his ear that tonight's voyage wouldn't be like the ones he was accustomed to. Out on the midnight black loch, under the cold gaze of the moon, he was about to embark on a journey of ancient myths and primordial fear. But what lay ahead, only the depths of Loch Ness knew. Having immersed himself in the quietude of the chilly night, Duncan set about his routine with an ease born of many lone vigils on the still waters. His faithful companion, a weather-beaten fishing rod that felt like an intrinsic extension of his gnarled, weathered hands, was held aloft, gently flung in an arc to cast the line. The hook and bait made a soft splash, diffusing ripples that spread and ruined the mirror-like surface of the loch. As Duncan peered into the inky abyss of Loch Ness, anticipation twisted a knot in his stomach. It was no ordinary apprehension one might feel catching a fish. This was something he'd never felt before. An inexplicable magnetic pull seemed to emanate from beneath the water, tugging at his line and resonating within his very being. Moments trickled into minutes, and Duncan was feeling increasingly unnerved. His trusty rod stood eerily still in his grasp. Not a single tug. Not a twitch. The loch was behaving bizarrely tranquil tonight. Suddenly, the silence of the night was shattered by the violent jerk of his fishing rod, nearly pulling him off his perch. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end, not out of the startling movement, but due to the magnitude of force tugging at his line. It was unlike anything he'd ever felt in his many years of fishing. This was no mere trout hiding in the depths below. His heart pounded in his ears as he grappled with his rod, feet braced against the boat's worn wooden slats. Beads of sweat started to form on his weather-worn forehead, and his breath hitched. The strength required to stay afloat amidst the violent tugging threatened to overpower him. Expectation and fear stirred in his mind, forming a cocktail of emotions that tasted strongly of unease. His biceps strained, his knuckles whitened, but Duncan was adamant. He summoned every ounce of his strength, anticipation painting vivid pictures of the monstrous creature his catch could be. All the tales he'd shrugged off over the years, stories shared by old-timers over a pint at the local pub, raced through his mind. And yet nothing could have prepared him for what was about to reveal itself, or rather, what was about to remain hidden from his sight. As the tussle continued, Duncan squinted into the depths of the loch, but the night had shrouded the water with its dark veil. Despite the vast blanket of darkness, flashes of swirling, undulating shapes flickered just beyond the reach of his sight. They were too immense to be mere ripples caused by raindrops, too powerful to be the typical loch denizens that Duncan had spent his life chasing. Suddenly the line went slack. An eerie silence enveloped the loch once again, a silence too profound, too complete. It reminded Duncan of the surreal quiet that precedes a storm, the world holding its breath in anticipation of the chaotic dance of nature. With the occasional plop of water hitting the side of his boat, the only sound that punctuated the silence, Duncan cautiously reeled the line back in. Slowly but steadily, the hook emerged from the inky depths below. It was empty. Startlingly empty. His bait was not nibbled at, as if discarded. It was carefully removed, an impossibility in the animal kingdom, a clear signal to Duncan that he may not be alone on the loch after all. Shrouded in chilling silence, he felt an unusual presence. Not threatening, but neither wholly benign. It was as if the water itself had become a sentient being, the centuries-old heart of the loch now pulsating with an unknown intent. Struggling to make sense of the peculiar experience, fragmentary images suddenly flashed across Duncan's mind. Old stories of the loch he had heard as a lad, tales whispered in hushed reverence by the elderly, shapes shifting beneath the moonlight, silent whispers echoing from the deep. Every local yarn he had dismissed as fantasy or exaggeration began playing out as if fresh mysteries were about to unravel. He could hardly believe that he, Duncan, the quintessential skeptic, was conceding to the realm of folklore and myth. Yet, the loch had other intentions. The moon's pallid light reflected off the black water as Duncan sat motionless, enveloped in the thick silence that clung to the night like a second skin. He realized that he was not alone on the loch. The myths he had disregarded so effortlessly were floating around him, manifesting as shadows and whispers rising from the water's depths. A chilling gust of wind swept across Loch Ness, bringing with it an air of irreversible change. Little did Duncan know that nothing would ever be the same again. He was on a path of discovering truths buried far deeper than any hook or line could reach. And with newfound trepidation, he prepared himself for the strange reality he was about to encounter. A web of secrets lay submerged, waiting to ensnare him in the murky depths of Loch Ness. Duncan remained anchored in the heart of the loch, cocooned by the eerie silence that grew heavier with each passing minute. He felt a mixture of uncertainty, apprehension, and an innate curiosity that he hadn't experienced since his boyhood adventures. Casting another glance over the water, his eyes scanned the rippling obsidian surface for any hint of movement. But the loch remained eerily calm, devoid of any telltale sign of the creature he now believed lurked in the fathomless depths. He decided to cast once more. With the same practiced precision, he hurled his hook and line into the abyss. He felt an odd surge of thrill, as if playing out a high-stakes game against an unseen opponent. Minutes transformed into hours. The night gnawed into the time as Duncan sat in a trance-like stillness, the water reflecting the pallid moonlight off his earnest face. His senses stretched thin, attuned to the slightest shift in the environment, his grip on the rod unwavering. Then once again, just as sudden as the first, his line jolted. A momentum so fierce it jerked the seasoned fisherman from his introspective reverie. But this time, he was ready. Summoning every ounce of his quickly dwindling strength, he pulled. Straining against the unseen force in a battle of endurance, his stance remained firm, his resolve unbroken. A tumultuous cascade of spray and foam erupted as Duncan fought against the creature, their struggle mirroring the primeval struggle of man versus nature. After what felt like an eternity locked in this tense dance, the beast finally surfaced. To Duncan's shock, there was no monster breaking through the loch. No gigantic silhouette shadowing the boat under the grinning moon. Instead, caught on his hook, there emerged an ornate, heavily tarnished locket, unceremoniously spit out from the loch's enigmatic bowels. It was an artifact wholly out of place in the context of his solitary fishing venture, and yet it held the promise of mystery within its rusting exterior. Spent of energy, Duncan retrieved the odd token. His heart pounded as he pried open the locket. Within it held an age-old photograph of a beautiful young woman, her countenance as serene as the lock's surface on a calm day, her eyes harboring depth and a story that seemed lost to time. Staring at the locket, a myriad of thoughts spiraled through Duncan's mind. Whom did it belong to? How did this artifact come to the belly of the lock? But most importantly, what, or perhaps who, had presented it to him and for what reasons? The realization dawned on him. His expeditions on Loch Ness were no longer about fishing. They were about seeking answers, delving into a mystery that seemed to be intricately linked to his own destiny. The thread of curiosity was now a rope of necessity pulling him deeper into the truth, a truth anchored somewhere in the unfathomable depths of the loch. As perplexing it was enthralling, Duncan was now in the heart of the mystery, a fisherman drawn into the labyrinth of a legacy held captive by the waters of Loch Ness. As the sun's first light streaked across the horizon, casting a warm glow over the Scottish Highlands, Duncan sat contemplatively in his small home. The quaint cottage, with its old stone walls and charming wooden trims, housed generations of MacLeods, but today, it held an unfamiliar air of mystery. A memento from the loch's depths lay on the wooden table in front of him. The locket, its photo hauntingly beautiful, gripped Duncan's attention. The woman in the photograph seemed timeless, her dark eyes mirroring the reflective depths of the loch itself. Who was she? Duncan pondered over this, his usual morning chores forgotten. Her gentle smile provoked more questions than answers. He needed to delve into the past. Duncan was no stranger to the tales linked to the loch. He had grown up regaled with stories of sea monsters, cursed treasures, and star-crossed lovers. It was amid these narratives that his destination became clear: Ailsa, the loch's oldest living resident and a keeper of forgotten stories. He found Ailsa in her usual place, rocking gently on the porch of her home, overlooking the loch. The sight of the elderly woman, with a century's knowledge etched into her wizened face, comforted Duncan. Ailsa, bemused at the sight of Duncan's consequent visits, greeted him warmly. Duncan, in return, handed her the locket. As Ailsa's rheumy eyes fell upon the artifact, he witnessed a myriad of emotions cross her face: surprise, recognition, and finally, a deep sorrow. With her trembling hands clutching the object, she took a deep breath and began her tale. The woman in the photo, she narrated, was none other than Moira, the loch's legend, and Ailsa's long-lost friend. Moira was a woman whose beauty was only surpassed by her innocent spirit and a love for the mystical loch. She had disappeared without a trace many years ago, leaving the small Scottish community in an absolute state of shock and disbelief. Ailsa then retold the tale of a heartbroken suitor who, unable to bear the pain of rejection, had cursed Moira to a life entrapped in the loch. She pointed out that slightly more cynical yet gossipy locals believed the incident to be an outright murder, and more spiritual ones thought that Moira chose to become the loch's guardian spirit. The tale sat heavy in the air, a melancholy note hanging around long after Ailsa's voice had wilted away. The locket was a tangible piece of an old tragedy that had become more myth than truth. Duncan felt an overwhelming sense of empathy, mixed with a renewed purpose. Whether it was to lay an old ghost to rest, or to find the remnant truth in the tale's tangled threads, he knew he had a substantial role to play. His connection with Loch Ness had deepened, no longer as superficial as capturing long-secluded treasures. It was about seeking a truth that would finally free everyone tied to the legend of Moira. He realized this was more than a quest, it was a responsibility he was destined to fulfill. As the day drew to a close, a single resolve echoed through Duncan's mind. Under the following night's sky, he'd once again journey down the moonlit ripples of the loch, tuning into whispers from the depths, seeking Moira's truth within the heart of Loch Ness, as a fisherman turned seeker. Underneath the resplendent mantle of starlight, Duncan made his way towards the loch. With every step, his heart resonated with the pulses of anticipation. He wasn't just a fisherman seeking his daily sustenance anymore. He was the listener seeking the echoes of a story long submerged under the surface. The boat bobbed gently as he climbed aboard, the familiar wooden infrastructure now a raft ferrying him into an ocean of mysteries. He felt a strange camaraderie with the moon, both of them seekers diving into the abyss for answers. Duncan began his silent interrogation of the seemingly placid loch, each ripple on its surface whispering hushed secrets. Midnight descended in full force, transforming Loch Ness into a vast mirror reflecting the cosmos above. The loch, true to its mystic nature, seemed alive, as if eager to share its hushed narrative. There was no sign of any unnatural creature, no terrifying monster ready to breach the surface. But the surf of the loch seemed tenser, almost expectant. As hours perched heavily on his shoulders, a sudden realization occurred to Duncan. Perhaps the answers he sought weren't going to be presented as physical discoveries. He needed to tune out the logic ingrained into him through years of a simplistic life and tune into the loch's spiritual frequency. With that realization, he closed his eyes, his heart pounding in synchronization with the rhythmic ebb and flow of waters beneath him. He heard the wind's whispers, the silent song of the stars, and the loch's undulating narrative revealing itself not through words, but through feelings. A jolt of sensation coursed through Duncan, unexpected and overwhelming. Images played out in rapid succession before his closed eyes. A figure of pristine beauty laughing by the loch's side, a devastated suitor crying bitter tears. The darkness swallowing the same figure as she plummeted into the loch, a lonely soul forever anchored to the loch's depths. Then, the peculiar sensation of something lost reaching out, the pull of a heart yearning to be understood, to have her story told. The images faded, replaced by a multitude of emotions, pain, regret, longing, loneliness, all merging into a symphony of understanding. Duncan's eyes fluttered open to the world he knew, but he wasn't the same man he was earlier. He had heard the loch's song, understood Moira's tale shown to him in silent echoes from the deep. He harbored no illusions about the daunting task in front of him. He had been entrusted with a spectacular responsibility, to bring life to a faded memory, justice to a forgotten sin, and ultimately, to set a lonely spirit free. Duncan, as the dawn's first light started to twinkle on the horizon, solidified his commitment to Moira, to the loch, to truth. The humble fisherman was inconspicuously absent. In his place, beneath the blanket of stars, sat Duncan the Revealer, anchored not by the fishing hooks, but by the weight of a past seeking redemption. He prepared himself, mentally and physically, to delve deeper into the saga of Loch Ness, exploring the cavernous depth of its past to emancipate its future from the spectral shackles of irregularity. The new day dawned in Inverness, the golden warmth of the morning sun creeping through the chill, driving away the shivers from the night before. Duncan, however, was immune to the quaint magic of the morning. He was buried deep in the pages of old and forgotten town records, held within the dusty confines of the local library. Duncan's goal was to trace back the veracity of Ailsa's narrative of Moira. He pored over every bit of the local history and countenance, birth and death records, residential movements, old newspaper clips, even detailed narratives of local events written by various individuals long past. The task felt overwhelming and labyrinthine. He often found himself at dead ends, frustrated that there weren't any explicit mentions of Moira or the distressed suitor. Yet he was relentless. Mornings faded into afternoons and evenings surrendered to the nights. Duncan, in his relentless search, had become a firm fixture in the library. Slowly, the puzzle pieces started to click. There was indeed a faint record of a young woman named Moira who lived around the time the loch's legend had been originated. Newspaper clippings spoke of her beauty and charm, her love for arts, and her peculiar connection to the loch. There were also mentions of a foreign suitor, a handsome traveler who often spent time with the lovely Moira. The proverbial smoking gun was an old journal entry made by one of the town's informal historians, a certain Jim Callum. It spoke of a sudden tragedy where a young woman disappeared without a trace, and around the same time, a disheartened suitor left town never to return. While the names were not explicitly mentioned, the timelines, the details, and the context seemed to match with Ailsa's narration. Yet something still didn't add up. Duncan struggled to connect the dots regarding Moira's connection with the loch. Fate came in the guise of a moth-eaten diary tucked away in a dusty corner of the library. The diary belonged to an old local shaman, a woman named Greta who'd lived around the same era as Moira. In the numerous ramblings of the diary, one entry struck a chord. It described an event where the shaman was called upon to conduct a ritual by the loch for a distressed, heartbroken suitor. There was a mention of a spell being cast, intending to tie the beloved to the loch forever. Shivering with the weight of the revelation, Duncan closed the diary. Despite its incredible content and mystical overtones, Greta's references carried an air of authenticity. There were potential truths veiled within the aged pages and faded ink, which Duncan was keen to uncover. As the day came to an end, and library lights dimmed, Duncan made his way back home. He walked under the star-strewn skies carrying a mix of bewilderment and purpose. Enough pieces of the puzzle were in his possession, though not necessarily clicked into perfect positions. The seventh day closed as Duncan considered sharing his newfound evidence with Ailsa. There was a common tale that bound them, a tale that slowly began unfolding its chapters inch by inch, ready to expose a past that promised to unsettle the present, yet potentially liberate the future. The following day, Duncan found himself at Ailsa's quaint cottage by the edge of the town. The old woman watched him over the rim of her glasses, knitting needles clacking softly, creating a rhythm in the silence that hung over them. He had come with clippings, diary entries, photocopies, and a thirst to share what he had discovered. Moira did exist, Ailsa, Duncan began, extracting the documents from his bag, placing them gently on the wooden table between them. And so did the suitor. Ailsa's knitting needles paused mid-clack. She set her work aside, reaching across to skim the plethora of historical proofs Duncan had gathered. A subtle smile played on her lips, a mix of delight and a strange sorrow. "I knew you were the right one, Duncan," she murmured, her gaze locking onto his. "But it's not just about proving they existed, lad. It's about figuring out why they still exist here, in a way." With that, she directed his attention back to the moth-eaten diary, pointing to entries about spiritual traditions, animistic rituals, and accounts of the shaman Greta's encounters with the supernatural. Ailsa explained that the community of Inverness was steeped in folk traditions, and spiritual rites surrounding water bodies were not uncommon in those times. It appeared that Greta performed one such binding rite at the edge of Loch Ness, tying Moira's spirit to the mighty waters. Duncan felt his spine go cold. To imagine that the legend of the Loch Ness monster might have been a distorted narration of Moira's tragic tale was chilling. They were not chasing a beast but the echo of an ill-fated love story, an anguished suitor's desperate action that perhaps condemned the spirit of his beloved to the deep waters of the loch. Ailsa urged him to dive deeper. Duncan resolved to find remaining bits of Moira's tale in the annals of the town's past. It wasn't about hunting the popular mystery anymore. It was about offering solace to a story long misunderstood and misrepresented. As Duncan walked home later that evening, the silence of the night settled heavily around him, pierced only by the far-off hooting of an owl. His thoughts were a whirl of insights and questions. Gazing upon the loch under the silver-dusted sky, he knew it would take more than mere determination to set Moira free. It would take courage and a willingness to venture into the shadows of the past. Yet, despite the nervous flutters in his stomach, Duncan felt decidedly hopeful. His quest was no longer a maiden voyage into the unknown. It had an anchor, a lighthouse. He had the past unfolding itself, history revealing its scars, and in those shadows, he hoped to find the thread of healing, of understanding, and perhaps, of liberation. Early next morning, under an umbrella of mist and a foggy overcast sky, Duncan embarked on the most crucial part of his investigation, a dive into the depths of Loch Ness itself. Teaming up with a skilled population of diverse and marine archaeologists, Duncan's goal was to investigate and map any unexplored regions of the loch. He promised himself and Ailsa that he would do it respectfully, taking utmost care not to disturb the spirit that lay yonder. Before setting out on their grand exploration, Duncan visited Ailsa, who gifted him an amulet, said to offer protection from any unintentional spiritual transgressions. The amulet was a stone disc, with ancient runes etched into it. According to Ilse, it had belonged to the shaman, Greta, a piece of her spiritual armor. Gratitude gripped his heart as he accepted it, promising to honor its legacy. Duncan was a seasoned explorer, but the lore surrounding the loch imbued the endeavor with a heightened sense of mystery and anticipation. The first dive was a reconnaissance tour, intending to catalog the loch's underwater features. As he submerged himself into the murky depths, the real world seemed to drown out, replaced by the fleeting shadows of fish and the ghostly echoes in the water. Days turned into weeks. Their exploration uncovered a labyrinth of underwater caves, oddly shaped rock formations, never before seen floral and marine life. Yet, the deeper mystery that Duncan had hoped to unravel, the spiritual binding, remained elusive. In one peculiar moment, while exploring a shadowy crevice, Duncan felt a sudden, inexplicable wave of warmth. It was fleeting, but enough to unnerve him. As he resurfaced, he found that his fingers had unconsciously been holding onto the stone amulet Ilse had given to him. A strange sensation of having been watched, of having shared that moment with someone, or something, lingered. Back on shore, amidst the drying gear and the setting sun, Duncan pondered. Each dive, every exploration had been like turning the pages of a deep-sea diary, only written in a language he was struggling to understand. Though they were making progress, the spiritual puzzle remained, taunting him with its complexity. Perhaps, he thought, the answers were not to be found completely submerged in the waters of the loch. Perhaps they needed to be unearthed in the world above, through words of wisdom left by Greta or further town logs he had yet to uncover. That night, a dream visited Duncan. A soft voice called out to him from the watery depths. A face, blurred yet vaguely familiar, emerged from the loch's dark waters. The face of Moira. He woke, the echo of her call still ringing in his mind. It was a message, he knew, one that pointed him back towards the land, towards the town's forgotten tales. Chapter 9 ended with a newfound vigor in Duncan. Tomorrow, with the early morning light, he would return to his books and parchments, guided by the whispers in his dreams. His conviction was stronger. He wasn't just peeling off the layers of a local myth anymore. He was following a cry for help, a plea from a spirit chained to the loch. The shadows of the past had started to stir, and Duncan knew he was at the epicenter of this spectral quake. Returning from the diver's base camp to Inverness, Duncan felt the weight of anticipation. His dream, or rather, his spectral encounter with Moira, had shifted something within him. Armed with this newfound clarity, he approached his research materials with invigorated determination. In the quiet stillness of the Inverness library, Duncan perused documents he'd previously overlooked. His attention was drawn to a collection, recently donated by a local family, pertaining to records of spiritual practices of the past. Among these, he discovered a detailed account of rituals performed by Greta, the shaman who had bound Moira's spirit to Loch Ness. The records contained translated incantations, ceremonial practices, and more fascinatingly, individual notes written by Greta herself. In one of her notes, the shaman confessed her heartbreak and guilt over the calamity born due to her rituals. She had believed that she was securing eternal love for Moira, oblivious to the pain it would bestow upon the girl's soul. Duncan's breath hitched as he read Greta's final note. There exists a ritual of undoing. However, it requires forgiveness from both worlds, the painful past and the healing present. Unchain Moira, unbind the loch. Let the world remember her not as a monster, but as a maiden who sought love. For the first time, Duncan saw a clear path. He needed to perform the ritual and ask for Moira's forgiveness, combining Greta's ancient knowledge with the town's newfound understanding of the identity of the Loch Ness monster. With Ailsa's help, Duncan began to prepare for the ritual. In a gesture of unity, he also spread word in the town and its surrounding settlement. Over the course of the week that Duncan prepared, fervor grew. The tale of Moira's true story touched the hearts of the locals who offered their support wholeheartedly. Under a full moon, the townspeople gathered by the edge of Loch Ness. Hand in hand, they formed a long, winding chain along the shore, their inner light mirrored in the moonlit water. Duncan stood at the water's edge, the amulet of Greta clutched tightly in his hand. He began the ritual, backed by the collective chanted prayers of the townsfolk behind him, their voices rising into the cold, clear night. It seemed as though time held its breath, the hush of the night broken by the resounding echo of their unified entreaty for forgiveness. As Duncan ended the chant, he cast the rune-engraved stone into the lock. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the water roared in answer. An immense shadow surfaced, undeniably the form that ghosted in countless Loch Ness Monster photographs, only this time, it bore the unmistakable silhouette of a woman. Slowly, the shadow disintegrated into 1,000 bright specks of light. They rose, forming a bright column reaching up to the moon, before scattering across the night sky, freed at last. A relieved sigh echoed through the overawed crowd. Moira's spirit, chained for centuries to the cold lock, was finally unbound. In the aftermath, the town felt different. An air of peace replaced the long-standing fear, for they now knew that the Loch Ness Monster was never a monster, but a tragedy from their history. Standing by the lock, Duncan felt a warmth descend around him as if embraced by unseen arms. A feeling of gratitude washed over him, and he knew he had fulfilled his purpose. He had not just solved a mystery but freed a spirit. Moira was no longer a monster but a maiden free to rest in peace, remembered in the history of Inverness not as a terrifying creature, but as a poignant symbol of the relentless pursuit of love.